Shabbat Shalom. Imagine, if you will, about 50 years ago, two absolutely adorable, identical young men standing at the bima on this exact Shabbat with voices probably almost as high as Kristen's, although not singing nearly as well, chanting from this, well, there it was. Chanting from the Torah and the Haftorah, and giving wonderful, absolutely erudite speeches about this Torah portion and Haftorah portion. Absolutely erudite, I have no doubt. In fact, I've been looking for that speech for years, and I know there was an envelope which had my bar mitzvah certificate in it, and my identical twins, and our speeches as well. And I know it's somewhere, and no doubt some historian or some archivist way in the future will find it and be amazed that I wonder what I said. I think it's lost in the past, and I have no doubt that the rabbi helped us and gave us some good ideas, but I don't know. I have no idea what I said at my bar mitzvah, and I wonder what it was, because this is in some ways a very difficult portion for a young person to speak about, and in some ways, with a little bit of thought, it's a rather fascinating Torah portion. Because Emor deals with, first, as I talked about earlier, the priests, and all the rituals that they had to do, who they could marry, what funerals they could go to. Then it has a bit on kashrus. Then it ends up with the holidays. And it fits nicely with the holiness code that we read last week, although it's hard to juggle the two. Last week, as we said, Kiddushim tiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem, you shall be holy because I, the eternal, your God, am holy. And then, while there were a few rituals there and some things like shatnez, which are absolutely profound, most of it was wonderful. It was dealing with ethics, how we treat each other, the kinds of world we want to build by remembering that we have to be holy and by remembering that we were slaves in Egypt. So you have the sublime last week, and then to some degree, you get to the ridiculous this week. Well, you get at least to the mundane, as we talk about, priests can marry this person and that person, but not this one and not that one, and they better not go to this funeral, but that funeral they can go to, and then there are these holidays. But it really isn't ridiculous, of course, but it's the essence of being Jewish. I could actually take the sermon I gave last week and say ditto, and then close up shop for today. Because if we think about it, what last week was talking about, and what I talked about last week was the idea that rituals as well as ethics go together to create what Judaism's about. Our ethical monotheism is both built on remembering the stranger, but also built on remembering the Sabbath. It's built on being holy in how we act in the world and remembering that we're holy ourselves as part of a kingdom of priests. So I was thinking about the Parsha this week, and I was thinking especially about what we do each night during this period, which is counting the Omer, and I realized that the Parsha is looking at the world in a very, very different way than last week's Parsha. Last week looks at the world, and it looks at it in a very material way, saying we create holiness in the space and the world we're given. So when we leave the crops uncut for our neighbors, we create holiness. When we remember the stranger, we're creating holiness. So it's creation through holiness, through action, through materiality. But this week, if we ignore the section on the priests, which I'll get to in a little bit, what we have with the last section of the Parsha is a reminder that we also create holiness in time. The holidays are a way of creating holiness and creating a holy calendar that reminds us that yes, there are lots of mitzvot and everyday mitzvot, where we find God's presence, but sometimes we need really strong reminders. And the holidays are really strong reminders of that we are in God's presence. The holidays are really strong reminders that God is with us wherever we are in the world, so that our holidays remind us, like Pesach, that God was with us in Egypt. The holidays remind us really on Sukkot that we are wherever we're creating harvests, wherever we're growing food and benefiting from food, there too we find God's presence. And of course, the unfinished aspect of the Sukkah reminds us that God is also present in the future, and that God is present in every aspect of time. In past, present, and future, we can find God's presence if we choose to do so. We can find God's presence in the little things and the big things, and reminders are great. Reminders are important. That's why it was so nice to celebrate Bill and Betty's birthday today, because birthdays are just such a reminder. They're a reminder of the years that pass, a reminder that allows us to think back on what we did and how fast time goes. Maybe that's not a good thing. But it's also a reminder of the future and how we have to count our days and look to the future as well so we can attain hearts of wisdom. And of course, time in that kind of counting way can be very positive. If we ask the kids in the junior congregation today what they're counting, well, they're not counting birthdays probably right now. They're not counting holidays. They're counting down the days towards the end of school. Just like we're counting the days down towards Shavuot. We're counting down the days till we receive the Torah. And that counting of time as we count the Omer is a reminder that we need to make sure that every day is holy. Yes, the holidays are holy in time, but every day can be holy in time. And every day helps us to receive the Torah. Every day allows us to prepare to receive the Torah. And of course, it's not always positive things that we count. So we're also counting the number of days since the hostages have been held in Gaza since October 7th. And there we count something, and each day we're sad because the people are still not free. Each day we think of the horrors that they must be going through. And that reminds us also of the value and importance of time. It reminds us also to value the time and blessings that we have in our lives. But I was thinking about time, and I was thinking about the Parsha as a sense of hope. And what does time mean as we look to the future and think of the world that we live in? Well, one thing that we do with our time is we get into habits. So that just this morning, my friend Andrew and I were talking about our habits for breakfast and how when we get older, habits get comforting. It gets really comforting to have the same breakfast, blueberries and yogurt every morning. Really well, it is comforting. It's easy. I know what I'm going to have, and I don't have to think, and it sort of tastes good, depending on where the blueberry's from. When they're from California, they're great. When they're from Chile in the middle of the winter, not so great. Then they're pretty tasteless. But still, it's blueberry. Yeah. We get into habits about time. We get into habits about what we do. And therefore, sometimes what we do in our time and how we bless and make our time holy are ways that are comforting, but aren't necessarily the things that we need to do to find God's presence in the world. And that led me to think about the Parsha this morning, especially from Ezekiel. So Ezekiel, as mentioned, talks about the sacrifices, just as the section of the Torah we read talks about the sacrifices. And Dov mentioned something very interesting. During the reading of Emor, he mentioned to me, I don't know if people heard, well, and if we look at Devarim and we look at Shmot, and also in Vayikra, because every book of the Bible except for Genesis, strangely, has a list of the holidays. After the class, we'll have a quiz on why it's not in Genesis. But why? But what if you look at the various lists, there's a problem. They're not the same. So how can we explain this? How can we understand they're not being the same? And if we look at Ezekiel and his description of the temple, guess what? It's even more not the same than what's happening in the temple. Now, in one way, it could be that Ezekiel was writing at a time and his tradition was different than the temple's, and that the writing of the temple was from different groups who looked at the temple ritual in different ways, which is challenging in and of itself, because it says to us that there are many right ways to follow God, not necessarily one. But another explanation of Ezekiel's discussion of the temple was he was thinking about what he wanted the temple to be rather than what the temple was. So he was envisioning new changes and traditions that would make the temple ritual and the priesthood even more holy than they were before. In a sense, he was saying we need to constantly reevaluate. We need to constantly understand our rituals and our understandings of holiness in the context of the time in which we live. So one could say that Ezekiel was the first conservative Jew. Or maybe all the people who wrote the different books that disagree with each other were actually the first conservative Jews. So it reminds us that when we take the habits of the past and we think about that breakfast we eat each morning, well, maybe tomorrow I'll have granola. Maybe we need to think and reevaluate and understand that which we do within the time and place in which we live. And that's certainly what Ezekiel did, and it's actually certainly what our rabbis did with the same sense of holiness in time. Now, our rabbis were challenged with an aspect of the Torah reading and the Haftorah reading that I think, and in my vague memory, is what I was challenged with when I was a little bar mitzvah boy, about that tall, standing here on one of those blocks so that everybody could see me, and my identical twin. And they weren't sure who they were seeing or hearing. I have no doubt I was challenged by this fact of priests and the fact that I was not a priest, yet here I was being a bar mitzvah. And if you think about it, that's an amazing change. That's exactly what Ezekiel was allowing for in a small way when he said that the temple rituals were different and changed from those that we know of in other biblical books. That Judaism has to grow and change. And the rabbis did that even more dramatically. The fact that we're in a synagogue, the fact that we are reading from the Torah, the fact that we're praying instead of having a barbecue, the fact that I can marry whoever I want, well, within some limits, and that I can go to whatever funeral I want to go to, makes a huge difference. And yet I'm standing here leading rituals, or at least being part, and everybody here also, we heard Svetlana, we heard Margie, we heard Dove, and they don't even have a title. Think about those dramatic changes. I wonder what Ezekiel would have said, and I think he might well have been comfortable that we made those changes, because time is not something that stops. Time is something that continues, and if we try to fossilize the past, then what do we become? Fossils. So if we want to be trilobites and eurypterids and other kinds of fossils, that would be great. But if we want to be evolved human beings, and even evolved, we have a puppy in the back, and that's as evolved as we are. It's on the same kind of evolutionary tree as we are. We need to make that choice. Do we want to be who we are now in the present as modern Jews, or do we want to be stuck as Jews in the past? We need to make time holy based on our reality, not make time holy based in the reality of the past. So Ezekiel gives us that challenge, and then of course we've run with that as we created modern Judaism. So we have these challenges of time, we have these challenges of thinking, and then of course Ezekiel gives us a further challenge which builds on all of these ideas. As I mentioned in my introduction to the Haftarah, Ezekiel's main goal was to create hope. And as I wrote in my piece on Friday, we live in a world where things are not perfect. There I talked about how we need to recreate a world after COVID, or create a world after COVID. And the Jewish community today is thinking about how we need to recreate or create a world after October 7th, both of which are hard challenges. All of our hearts are torn by the events of October 7th. All of us were influenced in myriads of ways after COVID and after years of isolation and all the changes that we had to make. So first of all, Ezekiel gives us this message of hope. But secondly, Shelley taught me an important lesson about COVID. She has lots of people talk to her, and people even are more willing to talk to Shelley than are willing to talk to me. I can't understand why. Maybe if she had an absolutely adorable identical twin, no one would talk to her either. That must be the reason. But people have said to Shelley, COVID was so hard. Now we need, what I want to do is I want to return to what we were. I want to go back. And Shelley says to them, and she says to me, and keeps me honest on this, well, do we want to go back, or do we want to learn the lessons of what happened at that time and come back even stronger, building on the past, yes, but learning and building on the lessons of COVID as well? And therefore making remembering the bonds of community even stronger, remembering the bonds of how to bring people together even stronger, not to create something that was identical to the past, then we become trilobites, but instead to look and become even more evolved X-Men, evolved human beings of the future. So I was thinking about that, and I think that's also true with October 7th. That we can't be satisfied to return to what the world was like before October 7th. We need to learn the lessons of October 7th, which reminds us of the dangers of terrorism, yes, and it reminds us about building partnerships and trying to find real strong partnerships with our neighbors in order to survive. But it also reminds us that even here in America, there's a huge amount of work we need to do. We were all pretending that anti-Semitism was gone, to some extent at least. We all had this idea that we were living in an evolved country where the dangers to Jewish people were not as bad, and where we had lots of friends who were going in the same direction we were. Now we need to think about how we can build a real peace in the Middle East. That's not up to us, luckily, but it's up to our brothers and sisters in Israel and up to the governments of the world to help out. We need to find how to build a real peace there, where the dangers of October 7th can never happen again, not to us and not to anyone. And we need to think about what kinds of education and work do we need to do here to remove the bigotry that African Americans have felt, that we felt, and that we thought was maybe going away, but now we know is here in full blast. What kind of education do we need to do? How do we need to change our country so that it can grow and learn and be better because of what happened, not go back to a past where everything is hidden under the carpet and we pretend it doesn't happen. So as we think about holiness of time, we need to remember that time doesn't stop, but time moves to the future. But especially, we need to remember that message of hope from Ezekiel, that message that, yes, we are still here, and we're going to be here, and because we're still here, we need to build and grow and look to the future, a future that's not identical with the past, but a future that hopefully is better than the past. Shabbat Shalom.